In the year 1038, a force of fewer than 500 Norse mercenaries accomplished the unthinkable. They compelled an entire Islamic emirate to desert their strongholds without a single drop of blood being spilled. These men were the elite Varangian Guard, and their arrival on the shores of Sicily signaled the start of a brutal military operation that would leave a permanent mark on the Mediterranean. The sheer scale of the psychological impact was staggering. A small band of axe-wielding Northmen caused tens of thousands of defenders to flee fortifications they had occupied for 2 centuries. At this pivotal moment, the fate of Sicily, a land where three great civilizations collided, hung in the balance. This campaign, led by legendary figures like the future King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, featured feats of arms so intense they became the stuff of legend across continents. It was a conflict defined by the strategic brilliance of the Byzantine general George Maniakes, often referred to as the Destroyer, and marked by the sudden collapse of disciplined Muslim forces that had successfully defended the island for generations. The story is also one of missed opportunities and political betrayal. Just as total victory seemed certain, internal sabotage from Constantinople undermined the conquest, leading to a tragic end for thousands of soldiers. Yet this often overlooked war served as a vital precursor to the Norman conquest, a transition that would fundamentally reorganize the power structure of Europe. To understand how such a small group of Vikings could paralyze an entire emirate, one must look at the state of Sicily in the 11th century. By 1036, the ruling Caliphate dynasty was fracturing under the weight of internal strife and external raids from North Africa. As the jewel of the Mediterranean, Sicily was the ultimate strategic prize. Its ports controlled the primary trade routes between Europe, Africa, and the East. For the Byzantine Empire, reclaiming this lost territory was a matter of survival and pride. The campaign was spearheaded by two formidable men. First was George Maniakes, a towering figure standing 6.5 feet tall, whose reputation for tactical genius was matched only by his pitilessness in victory. Beside him was the 23-year-old exiled prince Harald Hardrada, a ruthless warrior leader seeking to build his legendary status and wealth through the Varangian Guard. Together, they led a force that defied military logic, turning rumors of their approach into a weapon that broke the will of fortified cities before the first arrow was even fired. While history often remembers him as a legendary hero, Harald Hardrada's motivations in Sicily were far more pragmatic and grim. Having fled Norway following a failed rebellion, the exiled prince was driven by a desperate need for the massive wealth required to reclaim his crown. Sicily, a land of fabled riches, offered the perfect opportunity to amass a fortune through the spoils of war. The stage for this conflict was set by the tactical blunder of the local ruler, Emir Ahmed al-Akal. Besieged by African Zirid invaders and ignored by his superiors in Cairo, the emir turned to Constantinople for help. He proposed a joint administration of the island in exchange for Byzantine military intervention. It was a deal made between superpowers. At the time, both the Byzantine Empire and the Fatimid Caliphate were at the zenith of their influence, possessing wealth and technology that far outstripped anything found in Western Europe. However, Byzantine Emperor Michael IV saw a different path. Rather than sharing power, he aimed for total reconquest. Reclaiming Sicily would restore Byzantine dominance over Mediterranean trade and fundamentally shift the balance of power between the Christian and Islamic worlds. To lead this ambitious campaign, he chose George Maniakes, a general known as the Giant, and authorized the deployment of the Varangian Guard. Maniakes organized his invasion force with surgical precision. His army consisted of 10,000 Byzantine regulars, including cataphracts, heavy cavalry armored like mobile fortresses, and elite horse archers. 5,000 Lombard and Norman allies, led by William Ironarm, these knights introduced the devastating heavy cavalry charge that would later redefine European warfare. 500 Varangian Guard, the core of the terror. These were not ordinary soldiers, but elite Scandinavian nobles wielding massive 10-pound Danish axes capable of horrific destruction. Harald Hardrada personally led a hand-picked unit within the Guard. His men were psychological as well as physical warriors. They painted their shields black and marched to the rhythmic clashing of axes against mail, a sound that resembled distant thunder. The logistical scale was immense. A fleet of 300 ships, including war galleys equipped with the terrifying Greek fire, carried the army across the sea. To counter the 30,000 established Muslim defenders and the 15,000 Zirid raiders, Maniakes employed psychological warfare. He dispatched agents to spread terrifying rumors about the Varangians, claiming they were unkillable giants who feasted on their enemies. By the time the fleet gathered for the crossing in September 1038, the psychological damage was done. Panic spread through the coastal villages as refugees fled toward the capital, Palermo. The mere sight of the golden-haired Norsemen on the horizon sparked a terror that the fortified cities of Sicily were unprepared to handle. As the Byzantine ships braved the turbulent Strait of Messina, the ancient island stood on the brink of a transformation that would defy all military logic. The turbulent crossing of the Messina Strait, which should have spelled disaster for the invasion, instead provided a decisive tactical edge. While the local defenders assumed the storm had decimated the Byzantine fleet, the Norsemen, seasoned by the violent swells of the North Atlantic, simply laughed at the Mediterranean's temper. When the 300 ships emerged from the mist in a flawless crescent formation, the surprise was absolute. Harald Hardrada was the first to leap onto the Sicilian shore. Tradition holds that he made a grim vow. He would either return with enough gold to buy a kingdom or die to feast in the halls of his ancestors. This set the tone for a campaign defined by sheer psychological dominance. As the fleet approached Messina, the garrison didn't see just ships. They heard the terrifying cadence of 500 Varangian voices chanting war songs, their axes striking shields in a rhythmic thunder that signaled their arrival. The expected bloodbath on the beaches never happened. Overcome by the sight of golden-haired demons who stood a head taller than any local soldier, the Messina garrison simply abandoned their posts. The panic intensified during the first inland skirmish, when 300 Varangian infantry were intercepted by 2,000 elite Muslim cavalry. The outcome seemed certain. However, the Norsemen locked their shields into an impenetrable wall of iron and wood, a formation refined by Byzantine discipline. The engagement ended almost as soon as it began. The Muslim commander, a renowned champion named Khalil ibn Yusuf, rode forward to challenge the Norse leader. Harald met him alone. In a single, fluid motion, Harald's axe ended the duel so swiftly that the commander's body remained in the saddle for several moments after his head was gone. Witnessing this clinical, emotionless efficiency, the 2,000 veteran horsemen broke ranks and fled. To them, these were not men, they were something supernatural. Over the next 10 days, the army surged forward at a pace of 20 miles per day. Impregnable cliff-top fortresses like Romea, built to withstand years of siege, were abandoned without a fight. The pattern was always the same. The vanguard, Byzantine horse archers, applied constant pressure. The heavy cavalry, Lombard riders, provided a familiar looming threat. The hammer, the Varangians arrived, chanting their death songs, their axes catching the Mediterranean sun. At Romea, The defenders possessed ample supplies and outnumbered the attackers 3-1. Yet, at the mere sound of the Varangians beating their shields, the garrison fled through back exits, leaving behind untouched treasuries and warm meals. Maniax leaned into this terror. He established a specific ritual. At every captured stronghold, he spared only the youngest soldier. This survivor was sent ahead with a chilling ultimatum. Maniax is coming. The Northmen are hungry. Resisting is death. Fleeing is allowed. By the time the campaign reached Syracuse, the defensive network that had protected Sicily for 2 centuries had completely dissolved. Rumors claimed the Norsemen were invulnerable and that Maniax could crush a man's skull with one hand. In just weeks, the Byzantines had seized more territory than previous invasions had won in years. The stage was now set for the legendary Siege of Syracuse. Syracuse loomed on the horizon, a formidable bastion protected by ancient Greek walls that had withstood sieges for 2,000 years. These 40-foot-high ramparts, bolstered by modern Islamic engineering, were designed to be a graveyard for invaders. Inside, 15,000 defenders stood ready, gathered by the emir to finally break the Byzantine advance. George Maniace spent 3 days analyzing the city's defenses, searching for a path that wouldn't cost him his entire army. While he planned a complex 3-pronged assault involving naval decoys and cavalry feints, Harald Hardrada and the Varangian Guard proposed a plan of staggering boldness. They would take the city alone, under the cover of night. Harald's logic was simple. If we fail, you only lose mercenaries. If we succeed, you win Syracuse without losing a single Byzantine soldier. Maniaces, trusting the Varangians' almost instinctual ability to find cracks in any defense, gave his approval. As a new moon left the landscape in total darkness, 500 Norsemen moved toward the walls. They had blackened their armor with soot and wrapped their weapons in cloth to ensure absolute silence. In small teams, led by veterans of a dozen wars, they scaled the ramparts. Within 30 minutes, 100 warriors were crouched on the battlements like shadows, waiting for the signal. The signal was not a trumpet blast, but the sound of the first century's death. Suddenly, the night was shattered by the war cries of the North. The psychological shock was absolute. Defenders, awoken from sleep, found themselves facing the very demons of their nightmares. Panic, not steel, opened the city gates. As the Varangians methodically cleared the walls, terrified guards abandoned their posts, convinced the Norsemen were unkillable. In just 20 minutes, 500 men had broken a defense that should have held for months. The cost? 15,000 defenders routed against only 30 wounded Varangians and 0 dead. By dawn, Syracuse, the jewel of Sicily, was in total chaos. The city's commander found his palace deserted. His own guards had fled. Maniaces marched his army through wide-open gates as the Byzantine banners replaced the crescent moon without further resistance. The royal treasury, containing 2 centuries' worth of accumulated gold, was captured intact. In the weeks following the fall of Syracuse, the myth of Varangian invincibility became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Town after town surrendered at the mere sight of the Norse banners. Maniaces used this to his advantage, perfecting a ritual of calculated mercy. He would execute only the garrison commander, always with a single clinical axe stroke, and leave one survivor to spread the word. Maniaces is coming. Resistance is death. Flight is permitted. In 42 days, the Byzantines seized 47 fortified positions. While thousands of defenders fled or fell, Byzantine losses remained under 100. The Varangian Guard had become a weapon of pure terror. However,
At the hilltop city of Troina, the momentum shifted. A massive force of 25,000 defenders, convinced that the Norse demons were merely men who could be bled, decided to make a final stand. Positioned in a narrow valley that neutralized the Byzantine numerical advantage, they prepared for the most significant clash of the campaign. For the first time, Maniakes faced an enemy that refused to run.
The following events would leave a lasting scar on the history of both empires. Maniakes, ever the opportunist, recognized that he had the ideal instruments for a decisive blow. The Varangians would serve as the anvil, while his Byzantine cavalry acted as the hammer. His strategy was centered on a dangerous gamble, allowing the enemy to taste a false victory. The engagement at Troina began with a calculated display of Byzantine failure. Maniakes ordered the Lombard cavalry to charge into the valley, only to have them retreat in apparent disarray under heavy fire. The Muslim defenders, seeing the invincible imperial forces falter, erupted in cheers. A second failed infantry push further convinced the commander, Muhammad ibn Ahmed, that the day was won. As the Muslim forces poured out of their defenses to chase the retreating Byzantines, they fell directly into a sophisticated trap. 500 Varangians, who had spent the night scaling the treacherous rocky slopes in silence, suddenly emerged on both flanks. They descended like a landslide of steel. Their synchronized war cries echoed so intensely off the valley walls that the 500 warriors sounded like a force 10 times their size. The pursuit instantly transformed into a slaughter. Byzantine cataphracts swept around to block the valley exit, compressing 25,000 men into a narrow killing field. With the Varangians forming an unbreakable wall at one end and the cavalry charging from the other, the battle became a 4-hour execution. By the time it ended, 15,000 defenders lay dead. The Byzantines lost only 100 men, mostly during the initial feigned retreat, while the Varangians suffered only 8 wounded and 0 fatalities. The psychological will of Muslim Sicily died in that valley. The Northmen were no longer seen as mere soldiers, but as an inevitable force of nature. Within 3 months of landing, Maniakes had reclaimed 3/4 of the island. Churches were restored, and the Greek language returned to the marketplaces. Though his rule was stern, it brought a predictable order that many preferred to the previous years of chaos. Harold and his men had become extraordinarily wealthy, with the future king now possessing enough gold to fund his ultimate goal, a crown of his own. However, 2,000 miles away in the halls of Constantinople, the general's success had birthed a lethal jealousy. A messenger ship flying the imperial purple arrived, but instead of bringing rewards, it brought chains. Maniakes was accused of absurd crimes, embezzlement, and conspiracy, orchestrated by Admiral Stephen, the emperor's brother-in-law, whose own ego had been bruised by the general's brilliance. In a display of theatrical cruelty, Maniakes was arrested and bound like a common criminal in front of his mourning troops. The Varangians stood ready to strike down the arresting officers, waiting only for a signal from Harold, but the signal never came. With Maniakes removed, the momentum of the conquest evaporated. Admiral Stephen took command, and his lack of military experience immediately proved disastrous. He diluted the army's strength by spreading units thin across various garrisons, while simultaneously trying to push toward Palermo. This strategic blunder shattered the concentrated power that had made the imperial forces invincible. Sensing the impending collapse, the Norman and Lombard allies began to make their own calculations, realizing that the Byzantine Empire was about to throw away its greatest victory. Within a week of the general's arrest, the alliance disintegrated. 5,000 Lombard cavalrymen simply turned their horses around and rode away, carrying with them an intimate knowledge of Byzantine military doctrine. They would eventually return to the island, but no longer as supporters of the empire. They would return as its replacements. The groundwork for the future Norman kingdom of Sicily was laid not by enemy strength, but by Byzantine political folly. The psychological shift was instantaneous. The local defenders, once paralyzed by the demons under Maniakis, realized the master strategist was gone. The aura of invincibility that had been built over 3 months vanished in 3 days. Garrison commanders who had fled at the mere whisper of the Varangians began to organize a fierce resistance. Weapons were unearthed, and the emir in Palermo, who had been on the verge of signing a surrender, began planning a massive counteroffensive. The casualty figures illustrate this rapid decline. Under Maniakis, 30,000 defenders lost against only 500 imperial troops. Under Admiral Stephen, within 3 weeks, 1,000 imperial soldiers were dead, while enemy losses were negligible. The Varangian Guard's reaction was one of cold, disciplined fury. They had sworn their loyalty to the emperor, not his incompetent relatives. Harold Hardrada gathered his 500 warriors in the main square of Syracuse, where they raised their axes in a final, grim salute to their imprisoned leader. Instead of their usual war rhythm, they struck their shields in a slow funeral dirge, mourning the death of Byzantine competence. They then marched to their ships and departed. No Byzantine officer dared to obstruct them. The retreat of the Golden Demons was reported to the Muslim leadership within hours. Without their shock troops or a unified command, the Byzantine forces were pushed back like a receding tide. Positions that Maniakis had seized in days now held out for weeks before inevitably falling. Even the fortress of Troina, the site of the empire's greatest victory, was retaken in a night assault. By the end of the collapse, only Messina remained in Byzantine hands, a lonely outpost held by the last capable commander, an Armenian general named Katakalon.
The irony was profound. The emir, who had initially begged for help, found himself more powerful than ever. His internal rivals had been eliminated by Maniakes, and his authority was now absolute. Byzantine jealousy had achieved what decades of warfare could not, the preservation of the emirate. History, however, has a way of coming full circle. In 1061, 23 years after the arrest of Maniakes, a Norman army led by Robert Guiscard landed at the exact same spot where the 1038 campaign began. Among them were veterans like William Ironarm, who had seen the Byzantine failure firsthand. They used the same tactics Maniakes had pioneered, concentrated force and psychological terror, but this time there was no imperial politics to stop them. Sicily became the jewel of the Norman world, a launchpad for kingdoms that would redefine Europe. As for Harold Hardrada, he took his immense Sicilian fortune back to Norway, claiming the throne in 1047. Known as the Thunderbolt of the North, he ruled with the same iron fist he had observed in Sicily, protected by a royal guard of Mediterranean veterans. His journey eventually ended at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, falling to English axes. The gold he had earned through the blood and dust of Sicily ultimately funded the army that fought the final battle of the Viking Age. If Byzantine politics had not sabotaged Maniakes, the entire trajectory of the medieval world might have changed. A permanent Byzantine Sicily could have prevented the Crusades or shifted the Renaissance to Syracuse. Instead, the 1038 campaign remains a haunting what-if, a demonstration of how even the most unstoppable military force can be dismantled from within. This final chapter of the Sicilian expedition highlights the Byzantine Empire's most enduring and fatal contradiction, its ability to overcome external giants while being hollowed out by internal rot. The tragedy of George Maniakes is a recurring theme in Byzantine history. A man of Herculean stature and a temper to match, Maniakes was perhaps the only commander of the 11th century who truly grasped the concept of combined arms in a multi-ethnic context. Time and again, brilliant commanders like him achieved the impossible on the frontier, only to be dismantled by the insecurities of the imperial court. Maniaces possessed a tactical mind that could harmonize the disparate cultures of Norsemen, Greeks, and Lombards into a single lethal force. To the Varangians, he was a leader who understood the value of the shield wall and the terrifying impact of a flanking maneuver. To the local Greeks, he was the restorer of Roman order. Yet this very charisma was his undoing. In Constantinople, success was not celebrated, it was feared. Every province liberated was seen by the eunuchs and bureaucrats of the palace as a potential stepping stone for a usurper.
In the end, the 500 Varangians, the elite Norse mercenaries of the emperor, had accomplished everything asked of them. They had paralyzed an entire emirate, shattered a centuries-old power structure, and pushed the boundaries of what medieval warfare could achieve through psychological dominance and innovation. These golden demons were more than just muscle. Under Maniacis, they became a precision instrument. They proved that a small, disciplined force could indeed bring an empire to its knees by targeting the joints of an enemy's administration. In Sicily, they didn't just fight battles, they dismantled the Arab defensive network fortress by fortress. The sight of their massive Danish axes glinting in the Mediterranean sun became a symbol of inevitable defeat for the Caliphate governors. However, their axes, which had so easily split the helms of their foes, were useless against the red tape of Constantinople. While the Varangians were spilling blood in the dust of Messina and Syracuse, the imperial court was busy sharpening pens. Maniacis was defenseless against the bureaucratic assassination of court intrigue. This was not a death by the sword, but a death by 1,000 cuts of legislation, withheld supplies, and character assassination. The central figure in this betrayal was often the emperor's inner circle, specifically the powerful eunuch Joannes the Orphanatrophus, who prioritized fiscal control and political loyalty over military reality. When Maniacis insulted the Admiral Stephen, the emperor's brother-in-law, for his incompetence during a naval blockade, the wheels of the palace began to turn. Stephen did not respond to a challenge to a duel. He responded with a letter to the capital accusing Maniacis of high treason. The empire's greatest weapon was suddenly turned against itself. Maniacis was recalled in chains at the very moment the conquest of Sicily was 90% complete. This story serves as a timeless warning for any organization or civilization. It poses a haunting question. How many great victories have turned to ash because those in power feared the success of their own people more than the threat of their enemies? This Byzantine syndrome is a psychological profile of a declining superpower. When an institution begins to prioritize the status quo and internal hierarchy over its primary mission, it creates a vacuum that its enemies are only too happy to fill. The court in Constantinople lived in a world of silk and shadows, where a general's popularity was a greater threat than a caliph's army. By neutralizing Maniacis, they ensured their own safety from a domestic rival, but they guaranteed the loss of their western territories. Sicily ultimately slipped away from the Byzantines and into the hands of the Normans because the imperial palace was more terrified of its own generals than any foreign caliphate. The Norsemen had conquered the battlefield, but they could not conquer the deep-seated jealousy that would eventually lead to the empire's own decline. When Maniacis was removed, the glue that held the multi-ethnic army together dissolved. The Lombards revolted, the Varangians were recalled to the capital to protect the emperor from the very unrest his policies had created, and the vacuum left in Sicily was filled by a new breed of warriors, the Normans under the de Hauteville brothers. These Normans, many of whom had served under Maniacis as mercenaries, looked at the chaos and realized they didn't need a Byzantine master to rule. They took the lessons Maniacis had taught them and used them to forge a kingdom of their own. The Sicilian expedition should have been the crowning achievement of the Macedonian Renaissance. It should have secured the Mediterranean for another 3 centuries. Instead, it became the prologue to the disaster at Manzikert.
The Byzantine Empire did not fall because its enemies were invincible. It fell because it could no longer tolerate greatness within its own ranks. The internal rot was a preference for mediocrity that could be controlled over genius that could not. In the silence of the abandoned Sicilian fortresses, the echoes of the Varangian axes serve as a reminder. An empire that destroys its own champions has already signed its own death warrant. The lesson remains. A leader's greatest duty is not just to win the war, but to foster a system where victory does not necessitate the destruction of the victor.